I am David Cormican, and this is the charming and talented and ever-long resumed Noreen Halpern, currently of Halfire Entertainment, but maybe it might be good to give people a little bit of context as to who exactly you are, where you've come from, maybe talk a little bit about the E1 days and where you are now before we sort of kick off into what I believe is supposed to be a conversation on high-end television and co-producing or co-venturing, as the case may be.
Okay. I hate talking about myself. Okay, I gotta do this quickly. So here is the Reader's Digest condensed version, where I came from. I started my career in Toronto with Alliance, with what we call the School of Robert Lantos. So that, as Alliance, as Lantos was building the Los Angeles office, he decided he wanted to move a few key people down there. And so I ended up in LA about 20 years ago. It's shocking to think that it's been 20 years. And then as the merger with Atlantis happened, I stayed through with the company, and then CSI happened. And that literally is, most of you know, shut down the development division of Alliance Atlantis. And at that time, it was about 12 years ago, a really, really interesting time in the world of television, where there were a number of emerging cable outlets. And all of these cable outlets were hungry for scripted programming, and many of them had a really hard time figuring out how they were going to finance them. So I started a company called Blueprint Entertainment with my then partner, John Morenis. And our goal was really to figure out how to produce shows, really simple business plan, US, Canada. And that's kind of what we did. We worked with a number of emerging cable outlets to produce shows where these cable outlets couldn't afford to make the shows, scripted shows, on their own. And somewhere along the way, we got really lucky. A couple of things happened. The writer's strike happened, and the advertising market just absolutely disintegrated. And so what ended up happening is that the American broadcasters were all terrified that they were not going to end up with scripted programming, and a show called Flashpoint was bought by CBS. And I have to say, I really use that show as a massive change in the mindset of the American broadcasters, who up until then looked at Canadian television, for right or for wrong, as shows that they would buy cheaply and put on late night. And Flashpoint really proved them wrong, and they put that show on prime time, and people liked it, and no one thought of it as a Canadian show. And that then began a whole bunch of successes for Canadian shows, but really what I think of them as are shows that were made here, but just really interesting shows that work in the international marketplace, work in the US, and work here. Flash forward, and those shows included, we were lucky enough to make a number of those at Blueprint. One of them being Rookie Blue, one of them being Haven, which of course shoots here, one of them being Fitz, which of course shoots here. And then about 5 years ago, E1 came knocking. They were looking to figure out how to really become a fully functioning studio with theatrical, with television, and they bought Blueprint along with a company called Barna Alper and the joint venture that Blueprint had with Oasis, and all of a sudden we were the television division of that very large company. And I spent 3 years there, and probably round about year 2 realized I do far better being a scrappy independent than working for a company of 1,400 people. And so I left in March of last year, and I launched a new company, Halfire Entertainment. And the goal really is to do what I started about 12 years ago with Blueprint. I look at the environment right now in the world of television, and I see similar to what was going on 12 years ago, there is a whole new renaissance, and there are even more emerging cable outlets that want to be in this co-production business in the US. And there are Canadian networks that have had great success with co-productions, and to me this is an even more exciting time. But truthfully, I think far easier to be a scrappy independent than a very large studio in trying to put these kinds of projects together. And then the last piece of my story is that I formed a joint venture in March of this year with a company called CORE, and they are a company based out of Los Angeles, probably known best for being the producers of So You Think You Can Dance and American Idol. And yes, if anyone wants tickets, I can probably hook you up. And the point of that was, while I want to remain lean and mean and scrappy, it helps a lot to have the ability to have some money behind you. And this is a company that, through this joint venture, I will be able to deficit finance and cash flow TV series. I'll just tell you a few things that we've set up in the last little while, and the shows, the focus of Halfire-CORE is very much on co-productions, be it US-Canada, international co-productions, however we can figure out how to put shows together where we go straight to series and avoid the pilot system. So we've put together a few things in the last little while. A number of shows set up in development at TMN and Movie Central, at Shaw, Bell, a 10-hour that we've just announced that Tom Fontana's going to write, Billy the Kid for Fox, 3 projects at NBC that specifically are geared as co-productions with Canada, and CBC.
Wow. I want to back up 5 years ago, because I think not only is that when E1 sort of came into the picture with Blueprint, but also I believe you were on this stage 5 years ago as well. And there were some predictions that you made about television, and I'd like to sort of hear what those were then and where we are now, because it's certainly a very interesting time in television with all these over-the-top service providers such as Netflix and Hulu and Amazon that are now getting into the field.
So here's the truth. I predicted that we would be doing, Canada would be very much at the heart of doing more television. I had no clue there would be the explosion that there has been. I mean, I know there's a lot of people here who are focused on theatricals. A lot of you are involved in television. I mean, this truly is the golden age of television. There have never been such exciting shows being made. It's a whole new way of putting them together. It's wildly exciting. I didn't predict how far we have come. I think really what I talked about, and it's interesting, 5 years ago was the beginning, and it was really the beginning of what Canadians were doing. It was first year of Flashpoint, it was first year of Rookie Blue, it was the first year of Haven. Now when you look at what's going on in the world of television, certainly all of the outlets available, it's extraordinary. But when you look at the shows coming out of Canada that are performing on the international stage, it's really extraordinary. So all the shows that I just mentioned are still on the air, I think. Yes? Flashpoint? Just ended. Just ended. But then there's Motive, and there is the extraordinary Orphan Black. It's an incredible list of shows that are being made here and have an audience around the world.
So I had the pleasure of attending the Asian Film Summit a couple of days ago, and it was a panel on a film called The Master of Tai Chi, directed by Keanu Reeves and starring Keanu Reeves and produced by Keanu Reeves. But they came across something that's really interesting there, is they have an acronym called WIPBIB, which is White Person Based in Beijing. And it's something they are sort of, that's the focus of their business model there, to really tap into China, which is this growing market that people really need that trusted person on the ground where they can be that translator. They're familiar to the sensitivities of North American production and the market needs there, while also understanding what has to happen so it will pass censorship, so it'll make the financiers happy and all that sort of stuff. And I think it's fair to say that we can look at you as our Canadian based in Hollywood, that we can sort of look to, who understands all of the nuances in Canada and all of the nuances in the States. I guess it would be kind of interesting to sort of hear a little bit more from you on that, and how did you set out 20 years ago to become this person? Did you know that you were going to sort of be on this journey, this path?
I wish I could say yes, because that would make me sound so prescient.
Right. Well, and how do we find people like you so that as Canadians we can still have that person on the ground that really sort of helps drive that momentum forward?
So the question really is, how do you want me to talk about how can people figure out, how can other people do this, or?
Well, I guess how do we find people like you, and how do you become a person like that? What's the value to having a person like you as part of the team?
So it's interesting. I'm looking at Fred, who's done this also. Television is the same everywhere, and it's incredibly different everywhere. So what's interesting is there is this time that we're in right now where co-productions, and again, it's not just the US-Canada co-productions, it's also Europe. So it could be the UK and Canada, or France and Canada, or Germany and Canada. There have been a number of really successful international co-productions. The challenge putting any co-production together is you have two masters. And so as hard as it is to make television with just one broadcaster, or one partner, when you have two, it's doubly challenging or doubly exciting and interesting. It's very hard to bring partners together and have them effectively enjoy what they're doing and want to support it if you don't understand them. And I think that's probably one of the keys, and one of the reasons I'm really lucky that Lantos sent me down 20 years ago is I grew up in the Canadian industry and know the people here, and very much consider myself a Canadian producer, but I've also grown up in the American industry and know those American broadcasters. And really it is about, it's all television production, I think, all creation is about storytelling, but you have to understand the people that you're making the show for, and you have to be able to deliver what they want, and you've got to be able to get inside their head, and it's hard to do that if you don't actually spend time with them. Did I sort of answer your question?
I want to see the nods out there. Yeah. So speaking of two masters, the US-Canada co-venture is what we're all sort of chasing right now, currently in Canada anyway. Who comes first, the American license or the Canadian license, or is it both? How do you make that marriage happen? How do you manage
that? It's a really good question. The one thing before I answer that I will say is, because we talk a lot about co-productions and how great it is, and ultimately it's great because it's more money for the show and it's more profile for the show, but not all shows that I look at should be co-productions. There are some projects that come to me that I look at, and there's a project I'm developing right now, and I would never want it to be a co-production, because if I brought in an American network right now, they wouldn't get it, and they would try to make it something that it's not. I would say Fitz is a great example of that. That show would not have been good had we brought in DirecTV at the very beginning, because they would have pushed it to be something that it's not. And so there's a real purity to that show because it was developed for TMN and Movie Central, who had a very specific vision, and they worked really closely with the creators who had a really specific vision, and I'm looking at you both and hoping that you agree with that. So then there are some shows, and I'll use Rookie Blue as that example of when Alana Frank first brought us the script for Rookie Blue, she was very clear she wanted a US sale. We looked at it and went, this is Grey's Anatomy set in the world of rookie cops. Let's go get ABC on board. So I make that distinction because it's really crucial. And the shows that I look at that have not succeeded as co-productions, by and large, I think are because two partners were brought together who should never have been partners, right? It's a little bit like a marriage. And you need to, it's a very simplistic analogy, I realize, but both parties need to really get along, need to have the same vision for the show. If that doesn't work, you spend all of your time trying to convince people to make a show that they don't really want. So that is the crucial, crucial starting point to determine if a show should be a co-production or not. And it's not always just about the money. Yes, it's nice to have that extra chunk, but ultimately, these co-productions live or die on, do both partners see the same creative show at the beginning?
So you mentioned partnerships there, and I want to delve into that a little bit more in terms of how you're structuring each of these, and understanding that it's probably different for each, but when a project comes to you, you've got the creative, you're happy with it, you've got your, maybe a writer, maybe not a showrunner quite yet, but what's that first step for you? Is it getting the showrunner? Is it getting a producing partner that has an output deal with a studio? Is it getting a studio first? Is it going directly to the broadcaster to get that initial, are they interested? What's your first sort of step in your mind?
Every show, I have to say, is a completely different model. So it really is looking at each show and figuring out how you're going to get this thing made. And is it about bringing on, I mean, I think of my job as a producer also as a packager, quite frankly, because it's not just about finding great material or recognizing that there is great material and attaching a great writer or attaching a great showrunner, knowing where to bring it. It's also really about putting the pieces together so that when you walk in the room to sell it to a network, be it here, be it in the US, be it in London, no one can say no. And that very much is the job of the producer. And that quite often is significantly more than just a great idea and a great writer. It might be finding a fantastic director to attach. It might be finding an amazing non-writing executive producer. It might be figuring out, whatever it is, it very much is about how do you put all of the elements together so that person on the other side of the table cannot say no. And so I do look at each project very differently. And again, going back to where you're going to take the project, sometimes it's about, I know that I can get this thing developed in the US, and then I'll put a co-production together. Or this should start with a UK broadcaster, and then I'll put the rest of the pieces together. Or it's about, let's co-develop this between Shaw and ABC. But every project is so uniquely different, and the key is really looking at each one individually and figuring out how you're going to combine the elements to make people not only not say no, but ultimately to create a bidding war. So you've got three people who want to do it.
Right. Going back to packaging, so just putting together obviously the structural partnerships to it, but in terms of the talent, you mentioned directors, there's also showrunners, and other writers, and perhaps even casts as well. Do you work with the agencies, CAA, William Morris? Do you work with management companies as well, or the smaller agencies, or ICM or Gersh? How do they factor into your packaging, and at what stage do you bring them in?
So the answer is yes. And usually, it's interesting, Halfire is not represented by an agency. I found we never were at Blueprint, we weren't at E1.
What's the advantage to that, and why did you make that choice?
I made that choice because I feel right now I don't need to be. There's some advantages of an agency. Right now I'm in a place where where CAA and WME and ICM and UTA are bringing me projects. Now, I do have an advantage because, as you said earlier, I seem to be, our man in the US right now. There's not a lot, I'm not the only one, but there's not a lot of Canadian producers who function as Canadian producers who are also sitting based in Los Angeles. Although I have to say this year, I think I'm going to spend more time in Canada than I am in LA, much to the chagrin of my 5.5-year-old. What an agency does, hopefully, is they help you package. But the truth is, as a producer, you have to package. So really what you've got to do if you know you want a director is you've got to figure out what agency they're at, and you have to go to that agent and say and convince that agent why you want to have that director and why that director will benefit from working with you. So again, there's no, you don't sign with an agency and all of a sudden they open up their doors and everything is there for you. You still have to be the proactive one, figuring out what your plan is and figuring out how to make that plan happen. So yeah, that's the long-winded.
So if it's not Martin Scorsese and Boardwalk Empire, does attaching a director help or hinder?
It's a really good question. I'll start with talent, because my feeling is the hardest thing to do is attach a star. And that's because networks love casting. It is the most fun, coolest part of the job. So they don't really want you to attach a star unless you're bringing Julia Roberts to the table. Then they're okay. But the list of actors who are worth attaching is so small, and really they are those huge feature names. So I sort of put that to the side. Directors absolutely can make a difference. It's still a very small percentage, but directors will attach themselves, and they'll often attach themselves as executive producers, and that can make a difference. But it's a very small list. And I find you need to not just go to the agency. What I do, if I'm looking for a director, and there's an instance quite recently where I've attached a big director to a project which hasn't been announced, so I'm sorry I can't tell you what it is, but I went to the agency, I went to people I know who knew him, I kind of stalked him. No, really, I did. And you have to do that. I mean, it's absolutely the truth, because if you don't care more than anyone else, no one else will. So the way you attract someone, I mean, I guess this is a very long-winded way to get to the whole idea of passion, but the most important thing in putting shows together is passion, and absolutely never, ever taking no for an answer.
And are you bringing the directors into the pitch as well?
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Again, you only bring in, the director who you bring into the pitch is the guy where people are going to, where going into the pitch, they're going to say yes. Because if you bring a director of a certain caliber in, no one wants to say no to them. So that's sort of that's why you bring one of these big directors in.
I want to go back to your time split, Canada versus LA, and how much do you feel that you're spending in both, and how much time do you feel that people should be spending in LA to really be making an impact in terms of building those relationships and being seen and all that sort of stuff?
It's a really good question. There is a challenge. Again, I think it is a hard thing to do to establish those relationships in LA if you're not living there. The once-a-month trip is better than nothing. But I say this to producers I talk to all the time: if there's a partnership, one of you should move to LA. If it's one person running the company, move to LA for a year and then come back. You all know that this sitting in this room, when you've got, relationships are not just made by going to meetings. Relationships are made because you're living somewhere and you bump into people at a restaurant or at your kid's soccer game, or
when you're stalking them.
Or you're stalking them. Yeah, it's really hard to stalk them from another country. There is something, and again, I say that, and I know it's not that easy just to pick up and move. I got lucky where I was able to start my career here and then move to LA and continue it there. But it's a very hard thing to establish relationships when you don't live somewhere. And television is pretty simple. It's about great ideas. It's about bringing the right people together who are going to implement and make those right ideas work really well. But it's also about trust. And television shows usually cost somewhere in the $2 to $2.5 million an episode for an hour. So think about that. Someone is entrusting you with $2.5 million times 13. That's a lot of money and a lot of trust.
So speaking of the money, since you brought it up, how are these shows coming together right now for you? Like, what's, if you could do like a percentage basis, where is this money coming from?
It's a really interesting question. I haven't sort of looked at the slate and split it up. I would say it's probably, I probably have about half of the shows that I'm developing right now are co-productions between, actually probably more than that, probably 70% of the shows that I'm developing right now are co-productions between the US and Canada. 20% are just Canadian shows, and the other 10%, I hope that math adds up, are international co-productions. So you want me to break down the financing? And here's the other thing. I really, when we were at Blueprint, we set out to control rights to everything that we make, and that's how that's certainly the goal in this new company. So while, and my feeling is distribution is actually less important now than I thought it was when we started Blueprint. What's important is financing and cash flow. Because once I've got a show financed, there are a number of distributors that I can go out to and hopefully get a little bidding war going on. So the key is shows that are extremely well financed, and that for me is a really big driving focus when I'm looking at a show. Is this a show I can sell, and is this a show I can finance? So the financing is actually pretty straightforward. If you're looking at a US-Canada co-production, you're usually getting, and I break those into two categories, of the 10 out of 10s, which are becoming more and more challenging to make. I look at, a show like Motive, I think, is a great success story, where that show was financed primarily out of Canada, and the US sale is gravy. And that's great. I don't know if they knew going into it that's how they wanted to finance it. I will say for myself, I really look at my shows from the beginning, how is it going to be financed? And if I'm going to go that route, the 10 out of 10, 1 hour, then I'm going to look at how do I finance it completely out of Canada, and then if we sell it into the US, that's great, that's gravy. The 6 out of 10 1 hours are what I'm primarily focused on the 1 hour side, and I think those are going to be, I think that's going to be the future of these co-productions, where you get a significant amount out of Canada, a significant amount out of the US, more than double what the American networks are putting up on Motive or Rookie Blue or Flashpoint, and the American networks really look at them as a show that is their own, and so they promote it accordingly, which is key, which is crucial, because there's a couple of things that happen with the American networks. Yes, it's great to have ABC or NBC or Fox or CBS buy your show so that the DVD, when it's sold internationally, has a big US broadcast logo on it, but quite honestly, what I really think is the future of some of these co-productions is the shows where the American networks are invested in it from the beginning, and it's a true partnership with the Canadian network and the American network. They're talking from the beginning. It's not about the producer trying to keep them separate from each other. They're both making the same show, and they're both as equally invested in it, and they're both going to really promote it.
You mentioned maintaining the rights there.
Yes.
Actually, for everyone that may not be familiar, the 10 out of 10 and the 6 out of 10 that she's referring to is Canadian content points. And the minimum you need to qualify as Canadian is 6 points. It's creative points, so it's your writer, your director, your editor, composer, DOP, first and second leads, and who am I forgetting?
Cast? Did you say cast?
Sorry? Music composer, yeah.
And you know what, sorry, I should add one other thing, just because I didn't really finish on the financing side. So those 6 out of 10s are financed between big chunky license fee out of the US, license fee out of Canada, tax credits, and then you're left with a deficit, depending on what the budget is, depending on what you're getting out of the US and Canada, somewhere in the $500,000 to $800,000 an hour, which going into the international marketplace is a really low deficit. I mean, by comparison, most American one-hour shows that are launching this fall go into the international marketplace with minimum $1 million an episode, quite honestly, quite often 1.5. So there's a huge discrepancy there. Again, to give you an example of what a strong 1 hour can sell for internationally, easily 1.5, a broadcast network show, easily 1.5, if not 2. So you can see the difference there. If you're producing a 6 out of 10 finance between the US and Canada, you're probably in profit the first year. If you're not in profit the first year, there's something really wrong with the show you're making.
Okay, so I want to dance back to the rights now. When you have the Americans involved, they're used to owning everything, and how do you claw back that, and how do you find that conversation
They're not.
works?
Their studios are used to owning everything.
Fair enough.
So, and it's fascinating what's going on right now, because while a lot of American networks enjoy producing with their in-house studios, a lot of them also recognize that there's a huge advantage to working with people who are bringing them shows where their license fee is going to be half of what they normally pay. So the key is going in at the beginning and pitching this, and you referred to this earlier, do we partner with studios? Not really. The idea is that the key is you have to go in at the beginning and say, we are the financier of the show, and here's how we will put it together. If you're an independent producer, you're going to have a tougher time with that if you don't have a track record doing it. But what you do is you find a partner like myself or like E1 or there's a number of them out there, and you work with them, just make sure you get a really good deal going in.
E1, I think everyone's curious as to how that relationship works now that the Blueprint days are over and you're out on your own again. Is there a strategic relationship there? Is there an output deal?
There's not, and really it's just about, there's a lot of great people there. I'm very proud of that company. I helped build that company, but it's not they have a strategic approach right now to television, which is very, very different than mine. So they're developing a number of shows. We're really not competing in many ways. I mean, they are not as focused on these US-Canada co-productions. So there's no strategic output deal because that's what I'm building. I'm building another company, so I'm not giving my rights away.
And that's with CORE?
Correct.
And
yes.
Is everything now being structured through CORE? Is there an output deal there that they have that you're taking advantage
so
of?
The joint venture, the truth is I really feel like I got incredibly lucky. It's a great deal for me. It allows me to run my company, which is a Canadian company, and they're basically financiers. So it is like a distribution partnership, except they don't actually have distribution. And part of it is that they have a distribution strategy and they are building that, but when they started looking to figure out how they could get into scripted, they met with a number of people and they thought about building a division internally, and we were introduced by a mutual friend. And so Mark Graboff's the man who runs the company, who was co-chairman at NBC for a number of years. And he said, oh, well, this is a really quick way that we can build, get involved with production and have access to rights, because the truth is, that's what most people on the money side want, is access to rights. So they provide financing, and again, cash flow. I cannot stress how important cash flow is, because while financing is great, most of us can go and get a bank loan, and it's a pain, and you've got to fill out a bunch of paperwork, and you've got a bunch of financing costs. But the key when you're putting together these deals on the television side is cash flow. And that is what they provide to me. Excuse me, I'm just going to get some water. And that's really the thing that's crucial. So, so it's a great deal for me where I get to run the company, and then we split rights.
So, moving on to pilots and straight to series orders, there's sort of a change in the game that's going on right now, sort of TV 2.0 that's happening, where it's not that pilots are dead. There's just certainly not as many of those happening. So how do you get past the pilot and go straight to series?
I hate pilots.
How are you developing to sort of avoid the pilot then, that you hate so much?
I mean, and again, there's nothing, there have been some beautiful, huge pilots produced in the last number of years. And, there's some great pilots produced here. There's some great pilots produced in the U.S. The challenge with pilots is, the challenge with the traditional pilot development game is it's like going to Vegas, right? It's like playing a terrible game of craps. There's not a good business model there because the competition is so huge and you're spending so much money making something that may never see the light of day. At least, the great thing about making pilots in Canada alone is at least if you make it, it's going to air at some point. So the reason that I feel really strongly about only moving forward on straight to series is there's a really clear business model. And while I would say I am extremely driven by the creative, I really love the idea of storytelling, I'm also a very, very pragmatic business person. And I think television is a very business-oriented business. So the idea of the straight to 13, when I'm going in and pitching shows, either here or in the US, it's very clear going in that that's what the goal is. In exchange for that, you get a reduced license fee in the US, and again, significantly reduced, a third to a half of what the US networks would traditionally pay. And what I'm finding is, south of the border, there is a change in how people are looking at developing and producing. And it's what, I've called for many years the portfolio approach, bless you, which is, it's this, okay, we're gonna put this much money aside for traditional pilot development. We're gonna put this much money aside, it's probably a little smaller, for the straight to series. And you see it happening a lot. And it's not just Canadian content, right? Hannibal, very successful straight to series order, produced in Toronto, taking advantage of the production tax credit. But I look at that show and I think, I'm not sure that show would have been ordered for a second season if it hadn't been a straight to 13 reduced license fee. That's because you don't actually need to hit the same ratings numbers when you are making these shows where the license fees aren't so high. So there's a bit of a win-win for everyone, which is if I'm making these shows and I'm going straight to 13, I don't have to worry about the pilot system where I'm in competition with so many other people and the risks are so great and you need to achieve such stellar ratings to stay on the air. And we all know television needs time, right? People need to find a show. They need to get to know the people in the show. So the straight to 13 model works on many, many levels. It is more interesting for the broadcasters on both sides of the border because what most networks want is to make series, right? There is the idea of, yes, pilots will test out, does this work? But the truth is, I think with most television, it just takes time. It takes time to work out the kinks. It takes time to figure out who is working together well, what relationships are working well, what kind of stories do we want to tell. And that's what these straight to series orders provide. And I keep talking about 13. It doesn't have to be 13. It can be 10. It can be 8. The traditional order tends to be 13.
And when you go to second season then on those, and you've gotten this bargain basement price, are the licenses coming back up to market for second season?
It's a really good question. That's all in the negotiations. So I've seen it every which way. There are some instances where the license fee is negotiated for the life of the series, and there is a bump if you hit certain numbers. And I've also seen it negotiated where it's a very low license fee in the first season because it's basically first taste is free, with an increase in the second and subsequent seasons. So it's all just about how you're negotiating that deal.
Right. I want to get to a few questions as well in the audience, so think about that. And while you're thinking, I'm going to ask more about the brand. Are you going after intellectual property, like books, graphic novels, existing properties that already are out there? Or do you just go for a great idea and plan to execute well?
All of the above, but again, it really comes back to the project and the saleability of the project. And I really do focus on will I be able to sell this project, and not just in North America, but internationally. So brands are great. And brands can be an established brand, or they can be something like Dracula, which is just public domain. But again, it all comes back to a great idea is fantastic, but you have to sell it. So how are you going to sell it? Which means how are you going to, which is going to bring you the money to actually make it. So yes, brands are great.
And do you think that having what we refer to as convergent media here in Canada, is that of interest to American broadcasters right now? Are they looking at all of these extensions going, yeah, it's great to have that extra, free money? And are you thinking of that as well when you're developing these series? Like, what could the online possibilities be? Is there a video game? Is there a franchise to this? Are there spin-off characters or other stories that could be told?
You can't, I truly believe you can't not look at that. But I also don't believe that drives television. I think television is about what makes a great series. And then if you've got a fantastic series, you're going to have great all ancillary rights all around it. So Lost is a fantastic example of, it was a great series, and then people wanted to play the game. And then I believe there was a graphic novel. But everything for me starts with, is there a great series at the heart of it?